Welcome to the sixth Bible study with me and Mr. Caneller. My name is Katrina Kilpatrick. I am the director of Deconstruct to Reconstruct, a nonprofit I started to help people improve their mental and physical health on their journey in life. More importantly, I am one that was called by God. But first, to understand my calling, I had to understand who God is and what He created when He created man. And through my studies, this is when I found Mr. Sam Caneller.
Thank you, Katrina. I'm known as the biblical Hebrew go-to guy, and we're going to look into a lot of biblical Hebrew during the sixth study in Matthew. All of my books are based on that, the origin of universe, humankind, and woman, as well as the Mind-Body series, 2 books about mind and how to nurture and heal mental health. Let's get right into the study today, and we're going to start actually with the last verse in Matthew 2, verse 23. And he came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that is Joseph and his family, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophets. He shall be called a Nazarene. So, as I said, this is the last verse that ends chapter 2, and then it gets straight into John the Baptist, starting in the next chapter. Before we explain the depth and the meaning of this verse, Katrina, could you just give us a little bit of background and show us what Matthew discussed leading up to this verse?
Okay. So Matthew chapter 1 and 2 primarily focused on the birth and early life of Jesus. And we started with the genealogy. We saw that this was the beginning of the creation of the spiritual man. And we talked about being the son of David and the son of Abraham. The son of man, meaning that that was the physical part coming from Mary. So we got to when Joseph got the message, the wise men came, and then Herod wanted to kill the infant. And that's when Joseph and Mary had the flight to Egypt. And we explained that last week. And we were talking about the importance of the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies, which brings us here to Matthew 2 and 23, which is a prophecy that's really misunderstood by a lot of people.
So, Katrina, the summary that you've just given basically covers the very first few years of Christ. So approximately how old would you say he would have been when the family comes and settles in Nazareth?
They left and went to Egypt. So he was probably about 2 or 3 years old then. And then Herod died, and we know the date when that was. So he was probably maybe 4 or 5 up in the early childhood stage.
So really the first 2 chapters here cover up till about 4 or 5 years of age. And then we come to this incredible verse here in verse 23, where it talks about settling in Nazareth and how it fulfills a prophecy spoken by the prophets, and that he shall be called a Nazarene. So you've done a fair bit of study about this verse. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've come up with in the commentaries and through that kind of study?
Well, Sam, for the most part, most people misunderstand this verse. They don't see exactly how it's connected with Jesus' birth and the prophecies because it's hard to find.
Absolutely. There's not much about this verse anywhere, and yet we're going to see that it's a very fundamental and, in fact, a very, very deep verse. So let's just begin and start to go through this. The first point to note that he comes to a city that is called Nazareth, and that Nazareth is nowhere mentioned in the Old Testament. I mean, I don't know whether the city existed. I would imagine that it did, but nowhere is Nazareth mentioned in the Old Testament. And yet here it says that it might be fulfilled that which was spoken by the prophets, he shall be called a Nazarene. A Nazarene, from what is indicated here, would mean that it's the name given to an inhabitant of Nazareth.
So, Sam, is there anything special about the word Nazareth or Nazarene in the Greek?
We're going to switch to Strong's, and here we have our verse, And so we're going to look at Nazareth, G 3478. And here we have the Greek for this word on the right-hand side here. Nazareth. And what I want you to notice in particular is the pronunciation. Now, I know you can't necessarily, maybe you can read Greek, but the pronunciation is given right here. It's NaDSareth. And I want you to notice the D and the Z, and I'll explain to you why in just a minute, of uncertain derivation. So once again, I want you to note that even Strong is also a little bit in the dark here about the meaning of this. And then it says Nazareth or Nazareth, a place in Palestine, and it gives the city. And then we come down in the same verse here to Nazarene, and that's 3480. So 3480, you can actually see simply by the Greek words and the Hebrew words, they're in alphabetical order in Strong's Concordance. So this is only two entries after this first Nazareth, 3478 and 3480. And here we've also got, and I'm giving the pronunciation here, Natsar. So you can see it right here, the D and the Z. That's how we pronounce it from 3478. So you can see the relationship between these two. And that's why I said that Nazarene is undoubtedly the way they call the inhabitants of the city. And that's what Strong says here. An inhabitant of Nazareth, by extension, a Christian. Not sure about that. And his explanation there. And so we've got here Nazarene or Nazareth.
Are there any other interpretations of the word Nazarene?
Well, the commentaries do sometimes take a different approach to the context here. And there is a word actually that's very close to Nazarene, and it's the word Nazarite. We can see that there are a number of verses in the Old Testament referring to Nazarites, and a Nazarite was simply meaning here to separate themselves unto the Lord. And the Nazarites were people who were devoted to fasting, devoted to prayer, very close servants in that sense to God. But what I want to show you here as we get into the biblical Hebrew, and here Nazarite is 5139. So here we've got Nazir. And what I want you to notice here is the difference in pronunciation, because when we say it in English, it has the same pronunciation. It's Nazareth and NaZarite. And in English, this is, I think, where the confusion comes in with some of the commentators. It sounds similar, Nazarite and Nazarene. But in Hebrew, it's not at all similar. And we can see this here, first of all, by the pronunciation. Here, this is Nazir, whereas we saw that the other one had a D in here, Natsareth, whereas this is Nazir. And the key to understanding this is when we look at the root and the basic three letters of this word, in Hebrew, this middle letter is a Zayin, whereas, and here we have the primitive root of Nazareth, we have the tzaddik, and it's the tzaddik that gives us that pronunciation of Natsareth, and the Z up here for Nazarite gives us the pronunciation Nazir. These two words in Hebrew have the same first and last letters, as we can see by comparing them. However, the middle letter is a totally different letter, and these are two totally different words. So we are not talking about anything that has to do with Nazarites in this particular verse. We're talking about something that has to do with Natsareth.
Well, Sam, that's very interesting that the root is Natsar. Is there anywhere in the Old Testament where you see that?
Well, as a matter of fact, there is. And we're going to go straight over to Isaiah 11, verse 1. So here it is. Isaiah 11, verse 1, and we're still in Strong's, but that's okay. I'm just going to read it here. And there shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse, Now, straight away, given the genealogy that we've looked into in Matthew, we know who this is.
Mm-hmm.
And a branch shall grow out of his roots. So we've just been talking about the birth of Jesus. Could that be the branch that has grown out of his roots? Well, let's take a look at this word branch here in H5342. And here it is. If you recollect how the root for Nazareth displayed, you can see here Natsar. It's identical. It's identical from 5341. So let's first read here what the meaning of branch is in the sense of greenness as a striking color, a shoot. Now, notice this. It doesn't mean to shoot a gun. It means a shoot from a plant here, figuratively, a descendant. Hence, the single word translation, everywhere we see this word in the Old Testament, it's translated a branch. And so this is, first of all, the shoot out of his roots, out of Jesse's roots, which becomes the branch. And of course, this is referring to Christ. So we're going to go over to 5341 because that is the root. In other words, this is the basic meaning of this word. And here we have, again, notice the pronunciation. We have the T here, Natsar, Natsar, a primitive root. And here's the meaning: to guard in a good sense, to protect, maintain, and notice this word because we're going to come back to this in a bit, obey, or in a bad sense, to conceal, etc. One of the keys to understanding biblical Hebrew, that a word can have a positive and a negative meaning. Of course, when it comes to Christ, it's the positive meaning. So he's a protector. He's the one who maintains, or as we say today, sustains. And of course, as we know, he was obedient, and that's what we're going to see. But here is how the King James translators rendered this word: besieged, hidden thing, keep. Now, I want you to keep in mind the word that it's a keeper, monument. Also, observe. Keep in mind the word observe. Preserve, subtle. That's an interesting word, subtle. Keep that in mind. And a watcher or a watchman. And you can see, and we're not going to get into it here, but most of these, in fact, all of these words refer to Jesus Christ, refer to aspects of his ministry of Christ here. And this is what it's referring to when it talks about Natsar in the prophecy in Matthew 2 and verse 23.
So, Sam, you just showed us this verse in Isaiah, but in Matthew, it says it was spoken by the prophets. So, is it mentioned more than once?
Yes, as a matter of fact, it is mentioned more than once and by other prophets other than Isaiah. And of course, this shows that Matthew understood what he was obviously talking about. The Bible is the inspired word of God, but of course, God is using people who understand and who know the Old Testament. And so when Matthew says here prophets, there has to be multiple prophets that talk about this, at least two. So we're going to go to the word branch because that's what we saw for Natsar in Isaiah chapter 11, verse 1. So we're going to look at the word branch in the entire Bible because what you can do is put word and phrase, branch, search, and then you'll get every single location in the Old and the New Testament where we find this word. Now, let's just go through here because what I want you to look at is we can see branch here with the small b, but as we move down here, we're going to see branch. Here, look at this one. Branch with a capital B in Jeremiah 23. So let's read these verses here. Behold, the day comes, says the Lord, that I will raise unto David a righteous branch, and a king shall reign and prosper and shall execute judgment and justice in the earth. So I don't think we need 10 questions or 10 answers to see to whom this is referring. This is referring to Christ. And we've got here, raise unto David a branch, and a king shall reign. This is talking about Jesus Christ. And then the same thing in Jeremiah 33, verse 15. In those days and at that time will I cause the branch of righteousness. Now, notice that word also, righteousness. I ask you to keep in mind words like keep, observe, obey, subtle. Here's another one, the branch of righteousness to grow up to David, and he shall execute judgment and righteousness in the land. So once again, this can only refer to Christ. And here, once again, he's called the branch. And if we continue on here, we get to, look at this. Here in Zechariah 3, verse 8, hear, O Joseph, the high priest, you and your fellows that sit before you, for they are men wondered at. Behold, I will bring forth my servant, the branch. And then in Zechariah 6, verse 12, behold the man, interesting, the Son of Man, whose name is the branch, the Son of God. And he shall grow up. Now, remember, we talked about the shoot and how the branch shoots up here. Grow up out of his place, and he shall build the temple of the Lord. This is the temple of the Lord. Again, I'm not going to get into all the details, but this is the church of God. This is the spiritual temple of the Lord, and that's what he's going to do. So we've got this word branch here, and I'm going to switch to Strong's again, and we're going to look at 6780, because we'll notice that this is not the same word. The word here is samach, and it has absolutely nothing to do with Natsar, but it's got the same English translation. And this is what is interesting, and I would say necessary to understand the Bible. And when we start studying the Bible properly, is to realize, for instance, that the same English word, branch, here can have various original words in Hebrew. And here we have it. We have two words in Hebrew, tzamach and Natsar, for this particular word here in English. And of course, we can have the opposite as well, where we have one Hebrew word and how it can be translated with numerous English words. So this is where the study gets interesting, where we can look for correspondence and where we can look for much deeper meaning. Now look at this here, tzamach, branch, and here we've got it, bud. In other words, it's budding. It starts off very small, it buds, and it turns into a shoot, and then the shoot grows into a branch. That which grew, so it's talking about growing here. And of course, spring is springing up. That's the same principle that's involved here. So this is the word branch, 6780, but notice also that it comes from 6779, and that is the root here. So let's just look at 6779. Here we've got the same samach, a primitive root, to sprout. Here we have bear, bring forth, cause to make to bud, cause to make to grow, and cause to spring. So it's basically very similar, but it's this concept of growing up.
Well, I love how you make that so much clearer, Sam, especially letting us see how branch is used in the scriptures and especially in the prophecy. You just showed us how it's talking about Jesus growing up, that shoot, budding and sprouting and spreading out. So that clearly is telling us that these prophets are talking about Jesus. So are there any other details about his growing up in the scriptures?
As a matter of fact, Luke does go into quite a bit of detail, although it's very short, concerning Christ's growing up as a young child. And as Katrina explained, Matthew sort of covers the first 4 or 5 years, let's say, of Christ, but Luke goes much further and covers, with just a couple of examples, the rest of that period before his ministry, in other words, from about 5 years old to about 30 years old. And what does it say here? 2:52 in Luke. It says, and Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. Now, once again, we're reading this here in English, but in the Greek, we look at the term stature here, G2244, from the same as 2245. And we can see here it is maturity in years. So this is the budding of the child Jesus and the reaching out and becoming more and more mature as he gets older. The idea here, of course, would be to go ahead and look at the meaning of all these words, but I think that's sufficient to get the idea of what's taking place here with Christ growing up.
Yeah, and then if you look in Luke 2:40, where it says he waxed strong in spirit, filled with wisdom, I'm wondering which word is using up there for wisdom.
Yes,
Just curious.
that's the exact verse that we want to take a look at. The child grew, and that's G837, to grow, to increase, to enlarge, figuratively, etc. So once again, you can study all of these words now that you understand the concept and the principle that's behind this. That could be your personal study here. But as it says here in verse 40, he waxed strong. So check out the meaning of this: in spirit and filled with wisdom. G4678. And the grace of God was upon him. So he's developing into a very interesting young adolescent and then young man. And we have an example of this in Luke 2, verse 49. And he said unto them, now this is when he's in the temple questioning and answering the questions of the Pharisees, and his parents leave without him. And then they come back to find him in the temple with these religious leaders, which is quite an amazing story, indicating his closeness to God, doing the work, indicating his maturity, even at that time prior to him starting his ministry. And in verse 49, and he said to them, in other words, Jesus said to his parents, how is it that you sought me? Wist you, in other words, didn't you know that I must be about my Father's business? And that's exactly what he was doing. He was preaching and he was teaching. And they understood not the saying which he spoke to them. They didn't get it yet. They didn't understand. Although she was a virgin at birth, here's Mary, and she didn't understand what was fully going on. And he went down. In other words, Jesus went down with them, with his parents, and came to Nazareth, pronouncing it in Hebrew here, was subject unto them. Now, notice this. Here you've got the Son of God who is subject to his physical parents. He was subject to them. His mother kept these sayings in her heart. So let's just look at the subject here in G5293. To subordinate, reflects. Notice this word here, to obey. Remember, we saw that for Natsar. That is the relationship between this subject and Natsar. And this is all part of this prophecy and showing how he's grown up. To be under obedience, obey, under, subdue, subject to, put, in subjection, submit self unto. So Christ was a leader. Christ is the future king, and yet here he's subject in obedience to his parents. It's really quite an incredible story here and quite an incredible example. So we could say that Jesus was Natsar, the branch, the obedient, the keeping of the law branch, the branch that was subject to his parents, that he was Natsar in Nazareth. And that is the explanation of this verse that we have here at the end of chapter 2 of Matthew. In fact, this verse summarizes Christ's state of mind as he grew up throughout his youth. That is those 3 or 4 words: obedience, keeping God's law, a servant, subtle, wisdom, as we saw here in Luke. Those words are the Natsar in Nazareth that characterized Jesus Christ. And that is the last verse in Matthew chapter 2 and is the summary of his entire childhood, of his entire adolescence, and shows his full preparation for the ministry that he's now going to be started with John the Baptist in the next chapter.
But one thing that I think is important to point out is we talk about Jesus being the way, but we clearly see a good example in how God works with creation. God is not an instantaneous God. He could be because he is God, but he's one that likes to work and develop us. And we can clearly see that he even did this with his own son. There was a step-by-step process. And not only did he grow physically, but you could see him growing spiritually. And that's what those words are telling us in the Hebrew and the Greek.
Absolutely. And I think that it would be interesting, Katrina, to add a bit here regarding child rearing and the project that you have working with adolescents and how this all fits together. And if you could even bring in the principle that we're having all these mental health problems. And you said you talked about coaching. Can we mention coaching? This is what's missing in society today. We're not teaching our young children. We're not teaching our adolescents. We just had a 14-year-old kid stab one of the school attendants here in France, and nobody understands what's going on and what's happening in the mind of these kids. It's mental health because we're not following the pattern that God has set up for us here.
So, Sam, when I went into working with families and children and adults when it came to mental health, I did learn a lot in college. But again, we've mentioned that is the tree of good because there's good and evil. But when I stepped back from the field and really looked into the Bible for answers, I could see in the beginning, even starting with Genesis, how God set up for a family to be a man and a woman, and then for them to come together and create children, and then do the child development rearing with the man and the woman, together with the kids that they created. That was in the beginning. And then now here in Matthew, he's showing us the same thing. He showed Mary as the mother, and Joseph. And what are they doing? Raising Jesus together. And he's learning the law. He's learned everything that he's learning to be obedient. All those things are right there. He's showing us in Matthew how he created the family to be. And being in the field for so long, I can tell you that broken families, when they are broken and there's a parent missing out of the household, there's going to be problems. And with those problems, that's when, we develop plans to kind of support that. But I would tell you now that parents in the household together, having and especially the parent that gave birth to the kids or the mother and father, that system works out better. Kids have less, not that they're going to be perfect, but less mental health issues, less issues in school, problems. And even when they do have problems, when I was able to sit down with the parents to develop a plan for the kids actually were more successful with the plans when I had both parents involved. So it shows us how important having two parents working with the kids, how things can really improve even when they have issues, especially I would tell you with mental health and also physical health also, because when two parents are there, it's more likely that they're able to eat a balanced meal and get the things that they need, be involved in sports and different things because parents can go back and forth and pick them up and things like they're very active in their lives. And always noticed how much better it was when I worked with a family, like I said, that had both parents involved in the plan. And again, like I said, we are seeing that's how God developed it, not only in Genesis, but we're seeing that He showed us in Matthew.
Right.
So that just shows how parallel they are.
And now that you mention parallel, that's a very interesting concept. Basically, in Matthew, we have the end of the preparation. That last verse, verse 23, is the end and a summary of the preparation of Christ for the beginning of his ministry.
So we just mentioned about the parallel between Genesis and Matthew. So we are right now in Matthew 2 and 23. So in that verse, is there any parallel showing us how it looks with the physical man creation connecting with the spiritual man?
Well, as a matter of fact, Katrina, there is an incredible parallel. We've seen this last verse summary of Christ's youth, preparing him for the ministry. So let's just take a look at Genesis 2 and verse 25. And I'm just going to keep it in Strong's because we're going to look at some of the words here in the Hebrew. And it's talking about Adam and Eve. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. This verse is the last verse of the creation story. The next verse starts out, now the serpent, and it starts talking about the temptation. So this verse here in Genesis 2:25 is the last verse. It's the summary of the creation, and it's talking about the state of the man and the woman. So it says here that they were naked. And of course, we just stop at that word naked from a physical point of view. In other words, they had no clothes on. But look at H6174 here. It's the word aum from H6191. And here, the immediate translation is nude, naked, etc. But let's go and look a little deeper here. H6191. This is the primitive root, properly to be bare. Another meaning of this word here is to be cunning. Now, Strong says usually in a bad sense, but it is in a good sense also. And in this particular case, because it's the very end of creation, it's before the temptation, this cunning is a good cunning. In other words, they're using their minds properly. Now, notice it here, beware, take crafty, and counsel. Now, we use that word crafty a bit negatively, but if we consider that it can also be proper counsel, to be prudent, to be careful. And this is the description of their mentality in this particular verse at the end of creation. In other words, it's describing how they were after, who knows, probably 1 or 2 days after their creation, after the Sabbath day, because that Sabbath day is mentioned at the end of chapter 1 and also at the beginning of chapter 2. And notice this last definition here. This is a description of the mental outlook of Adam and Eve before the temptation. And they were in a totally positive outlook, as it says here, and these words don't necessarily reflect it, but they were prudent and they knew how to dealing subtly in the positive sense. They knew how to make decisions. They knew how to think. They knew how to reason properly because God had taught them on the preceding Sabbath. The point being here is that this is the state of the first man and the first woman immediately after creation. It describes their preparation for life on earth. That's what it's doing here. And the parallel is that this is the state of the first man as he begins, as I said, his life on earth. And when we look at the spiritual man, as we saw in Matthew 2:23, that is the state of Christ, who is now a man, and it is the state after his preparation. So we actually have the first man in this positive mental state, and we have the spiritual man also in a positive mental and spiritual state.
Well, Sam, what exactly did God want from Adam? I mean, in the beginning, it was just man and God before Eve was created. So, what was his commands? What did he want from man? What did he want him to do with this mind that he gave him?
Yes, we can see in Matthew chapter 2 what Christ did with his mind and how he developed that mind. So, what's the parallel to that in Genesis chapter 2 here? And we can see it, what God wanted in verse 15. And the Lord God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to dress it and to keep it. Now, when we read verses like this, we think dress and keep, and we think that probably Adam was destined to be maybe a gardener and plant and grow flowers. But that's not what it's referring to here. So let's just take a look at this very, very quickly when it says to dress. Look at the meaning of this. 56:47. Again, you can read all of these things, but here, serve. Now remember, these are things that Christ did. He served, service, keep. Remember, I asked you to keep in mind the word keep. Here it is again. It's to keep. But notice this last translation here, worshiper. That is what God called Adam to do, to worship. And it's not worship the garden. Again, I can't get into all of the details here, but it's basically to worship God, obviously. So that is the frame of mind that Adam was in with Eve at the end of chapter 2 when they were naked. Now, we already said, keep in mind, keep, because that's what characterized Natsar and Jesus. But here, look at what keep means. It means to be circumspect, take heed, to keep, to mark, observe. Remember, I asked you to keep in mind the word observe, and here we find it again, to preserve, reserve, to save, and to watch. Also another word that came up with Natsar. So we're talking here about keeping God's way, keeping God's law, being God's servant. And that is what God did with Adam and Eve in preparing them. And that's the state of mind they were in at the end of this verse, to the point where it says here, they were not ashamed. And that's H954. And look at what H954 is here. They were not confounded. There was no confusion. This is the mental state of mind that Adam and Eve were in. Now, if you want more details about all of this, you can go over to theexplanation.com/naked. And there's a free mini course there where you can see all of the understanding of these words and this verse 25 here in Genesis 2 and get all of the details. But the point here in conclusion is that we look at a verse in the Bible and we try and gather something about that verse. Unfortunately, with regard to Matthew chapter 2 and verse 23, it's more pickings than gatherings. And there's very little comprehension there. We've understood now the micro meaning of that verse, but we've also put it in a macro view of the Old Testament, the New Testament, the preparation of Adam and Eve, the preparation of Jesus Christ, the first man and the second man. The first man physically, mentally alert, the second man spiritually, mental alert and prepared, each one for their mission. For Adam, it was to live in the world, and for Christ, it was to live spiritually in the world.
Physical righteousness was Genesis with Adam, and then we're looking at spiritual righteousness with Jesus. One thing that this is really opening my mind to is the parallel between Genesis and Matthew. And that's the reason why we're taking it slow, going verse by verse, word by word, to really connect. to understand that Genesis is talking about the physical creation, but Matthew, the first book in the New Testament, is talking about the spiritual creation. And even looking at the word Nazareth today and looking at the shoot and how Jesus grew, and then just even breaking it down to the Hebrew, looking at the branch, bringing all that together. And then the verse at the end showing us that God was bringing back, restoring the spiritual righteousness, but also bringing in the physical righteousness and restoring that back. And that's what we should see in the New Testament, that needed to be brought back together. And that's why he had to come as human and the divine at the same time, because only he could do that because he's the creator.
Well, thank you for joining us for this Bible study. And thank you, Katrina, for helping me present this. And we shall see you next week.
Bye.
Bye-bye.